Our next speaker is Dr. James Kroll. Dr. Kroll has been the Director of Research Integrity and Administrative Investigations for the National Science Foundation's Office of the Inspector General since April of 2001. In this role, Dr. Kroll is primarily responsible for leading the investigation and resolution of all allegations that, if substantiated, would result in administrative action rather than civil or criminal prosecution. Please welcome Dr. James Kroll.
Thank you. When I was putting the final touches on the slide yesterday, I decided to put this picture on for those of you who have had enough of the southern progression of the polar vortex. And I'm a meteorologist by training, so I knew about the polar vortex 30 years ago. It's nothing new, really. It's just the fact that it's come so far south this year. Okay. So who is NSF OIG? Well, actually, pretty much every government agency has an inspector general, and we're responsible for making sure that there is efficiency and effectiveness in the agency that we represent in their operations. And most IGs, like NSF OIG, have two sides: an audit side, which gets involved in the accounting aspect as well as process aspects. And then we also have the investigation side, which is broken up into two main groups. Those that look at allegations of civil criminal violations, actually stealing the money, and then have a group of a half a dozen scientists turned super sleuths that work for me, with me, on issues primarily of research misconduct. And there's a reason why Dave and I are here, and that's because when it comes to issues of research misconduct in the related to federal government funding, metaphorically, we're kind of the two 500-pound gorillas in the room. No, I say that seriously. We are the leading force in this area. There are other agencies that have an interest in it, but it's always resources versus the issues you have to deal with. Having said that, Sue Garfinkel, who works for Dave, is doing an excellent job in spearheading a working group of folks from a variety of other agencies that have an interest in learning more about this. And Sue and I have been working together on that to bring some of the other agencies up to speed. Okay, so I said we were about promoting economy, efficiency, effectiveness. Again, two sides of the office when it comes to investigations. And where does research misconduct fit in all of this? Well, at NSF, the responsibility for investigating allegations of research misconduct is delegated to our office. That's the reason why I'm here. That's the reason why I have a job, is because the agency says, IG, will you please take care of this? And so we're the responsible entity within NSF. I like to take a slide, because we're the two gorillas in the room. I like to kind of differentiate a little bit between the two offices. There are some slight differences in the way we work, and I'm not doing this to say one is better than the other, because Dave actually has some things in his office that I'm extremely envious of when it's all said and done. But we do operate a little differently, and I will say from the perspective of plagiarism, I think we are a little more aggressive on it. And I think there are some historical reasons for that, number one. Number two, the agency takes it very seriously. But we're all both responsible for taking in allegations, referring matters to institutions, just like Dave had mentioned. When an allegation comes in, it usually gets referred back to the institution. The institution runs its process, gives us its report at the end, and we make a decision from there where we go forward. Some of the decisions, or some of the differences between the two offices, they do negotiate voluntary exclusions. Our office strictly does the investigation. If someone wants to get into a voluntary exclusion, they actually have to go to the Office of the General Counsel of NSF to do that. We do have the ability to independently investigate once the institution is complete. And we are a law enforcement agency, therefore we actually have the ability to subpoena records at times. We can't subpoena testimony, but we can subpoena records. We had an interesting, actually we have an ongoing case that involves data fabrication, where the subject kept saying, well, I have the real data, but I don't want to turn it over to the institution's investigation committee because they'll turn it around on us. So we submitted a subpoena, at which point they said, oops, we don't have anything. Okay, you got an allegation of data fabrication against you, and now you're lying to us. The federal government doesn't like when people lie. Of course, it doesn't always like when it tells the truth either, AKA Mr. Snowden, but I'm not making a comment on that. I'm not making a comment on that. I'm a retired military guy. So, but anyway, we don't like it when you lie to us. How do my slides keep moving ahead? There we go. One of the things I'm very envious of that Dave has, he has this education and outreach capability that we don't have at NSF. We try to do it, we try to come out and do these kind of talks, but we're very limited in how much traveling we can do, especially after the, was it GSA? That had the debacle with the Las Vegas thing? Well, you know, and so there's a reaction to that. Okay, and Congress basically comes back and says you got to look at your travel budget and only travel when it's necessary. And so, you know, that creates a little bit of a problem for us. And then, as Dave mentioned, they publish all the findings in the Federal Register. Thank you. Whereas all of our closeouts wind up being published online. But if it doesn't involve what's called a debarment, the names get redacted out, so you don't see what the names are. Whoops. So why do we care about research misconduct and plagiarism? Well, part of it is a fairness issue. I mean, NSF program officers and reviewers are looking at these proposals and trying to assess what's the best science being proposed. And if you're putting false data in there or you're plagiarizing, you're misleading the reviewers as to what you may know or what you may have accomplished previously. There's another issue about economy and effectiveness, is that we don't want to pay for research that's already been done. We don't want the work substantively misrepresented. So the question is, how does this compare? How does this notion of false representation of data and misleading the panelists, the reviewers, how does that compare with fraud? Well, the definition of fraud is a representation of material fact to induce another to act to their detriment. So if you're presenting false information, you may be creating a situation where a program officer at NSF is making a decision that they wouldn't have done if they had known. And in a number of our cases that involve funded grants, we will go back to the program officer and say, if you had known that this was true, the allegation, would you have funded this research? And that becomes a pivotal question in terms of how we proceed with the case. Because sometimes we can look at, even though research misconduct, the process is generally administrative, sometimes there can be a civil or criminal aspect to it, especially if it involves a small business. So what's appropriate credit? Well, that can vary a little bit by the relevant research community. Community standards are an important part of the judgment, because standards can vary from one discipline to another. But generally speaking, you're trying to make sure that anything you've copied or substantively paraphrased, you map it back to where you got it from. And we use a little acronym, QCR. I consider this sort of the get out of jail free card, okay? If you quote it, come on now. If you quote it, or indent it, cite it, and make sure the citation is in your reference list, you're never going to go wrong. Never. Okay? General rule, when you're quoting it, it should be clear and obvious what was copied. Usually there's two standard methods for that. You either put it in quotes or you indent it and then put a footnote at the end, and the footnote leads you to the source. Either of those are always good. Now, there are cases sometimes where language can be technically constrained, and there's no other way to say it. And we will have subjects come back to us and say, this was technically constrained. Okay, show us an example or two of where the identical language shows up in another, other than the source, in another location. Every once in a while they're able to do that, but rarely. It's a rare instance. Okay, so another thing that kind of gets us stirred up a little bit is when folks copy text and they actually copy across the references that are in the source. What we refer to this as is embedded citations. So what happens if you're a reviewer? What happens when you read that text? You're reading along and you say, okay, number 2, whatever the reference was, 3, 4, 5, 6. That expresses to the reader or reviewer that the author knows what these articles are, and he's read them, and he understands them. He's using them as reference. So when you cut and paste a block of text that has references in it, and then you drop it into your NSF proposal, it's telling the reviewers the same thing. But in actuality, you haven't. You may not even know what those articles are. In a lot of cases, people don't know, and we see this a lot. To us, this actually heightens the seriousness of the copied text. As I said, community standards become an important part in judging whether or not something winds up being plagiarism, and there are a lot of places where you can go to find those community standards. One of our surefire things that we look at when we have an allegation is we'll go to professional societies and journal policies. Because if someone is publishing in a journal, then they should be abiding by those policies. So I threw up a couple questions here. Is there a different standard for faculty versus students? Students? Do you think there's a different standard? No one's willing to say yes anyway. Well, it's interesting. We actually had a case where at an institution that involved a faculty member, we couldn't find a policy on academic misconduct for faculty. But we could find loads of policies about academic misconduct about students. And in that case, we actually had to use the student misconduct, the words of the student misconduct policy as the baseline for suggesting that NSF make a finding of research misconduct. But we basically said if the school is going to hold the students to this level, it only seems fair, well, I don't think we use the word fair, it only seems right that they hold the faculty to a similar standard. Are there different standards for proposals versus peer-reviewed journals? The answer is not really. And this is a little bit of a misconception because we will have subjects come back and say, well, it was just a proposal. It wasn't like it was a published article. But NSF is pretty clear in its grant proposal guide that it expects proposals to follow the proper scholarship standards. That means appropriate citation and reference, quotation if necessary, when you're using other people's material. So let's talk real briefly about our process. If we have an allegation that comes into our office, starts as an inquiry, in plagiarism, we'll always write to the subject. We have a responsibility to write to the subject first when we can, to ask them to explain it away for two reasons. One, they may have a very good explanation. There are times that we find what we think is copied text, and in actuality, we missed a reference somewhere, and it turns out they published an article 8 years ago that had the same text in it. They were the author of the text, and okay, we made a mistake. And so by writing directly to them, that keeps it's just between us and them. Nobody else knows. And confidentiality is an important part of any process when you're investigating someone. If we find that there is substance to an allegation, we'll then refer it to the institution and allow them to take their process. We usually give them 180 days to do that. Once it comes back, if we need to do, and often we do with university reports, there are like little holes that need to be filled in sometimes. We'll go ahead and do that by asking some additional questions. Then we send it forward to the agency. The agency, specifically the deputy director, is the one that adjudicates all the matters, makes the decision on whether or not it's research misconduct and what actions NSF will take. The individual does have a right of appeal. That appeal goes to the director. Director's decision is final, although they can take it to a federal administrative court if they want. Knock on wood. I think this is wood, or something like it. We've never had one that went that far yet. And then we put our closeouts online. So you can actually go to our website and look at all of our closed cases going all the way back to 1990 if you wanted to. What does it take to make a finding of research misconduct? 4 basic elements. 1, the act must meet the definition. 2, you got to have a culpable intent. I'll talk more about that in 1 minute. Preponderance of the evidence. The scales of justice, they just have to tip a little bit in favor. In other words, it's like a 51-49. If 51% of the evidence says it was done, then that's enough to make a finding. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt like you'll see in a criminal case. And the act must be a significant departure from accepted practice, which David mentioned before. So let's talk a little bit about intent. So there are 4 levels of intent: careless, reckless, knowing, intentional. Intentional is pretty obvious. You knew what you were doing, and you had a plan to deceive someone. It was a planned deception. That's intentional. Knowing is I knew what I was doing, and I didn't do it anyway, but it wasn't really part of a planned deception. Those 2 are pretty easy. The 2 where we get a little murkier are careless and reckless. Okay? Because they become what's called the reasonable person standard. By law, careless is basically a reasonable person would have known better not to do that, but whatever act they committed was not a significant departure from what a reasonable person would have done. Reckless, however, is a reasonable person would have known better, and the act was a significant departure from what an acceptable person has done. So you can see there's a connection between the careless, reckless definitions and that significant departure from accepted practice element that we talked about a little bit earlier. And the problem is, we all, I think, as individuals have different ideas of what it means for someone to be careless or reckless. Reckless sometimes in the legal world is also known as grossly negligent. Okay? But that's what we work with when we're trying to determine whether or not to recommend a finding. As far as how we get our allegations, you'd be surprised how many of them, again, as Dave mentioned earlier, how many times people copy into their proposals and they're copying material that the reviewers wrote. I mean, literally probably about 50% of our allegations come that way. Now, it doesn't surprise me when someone recognizes text they wrote, but there was a case about 2 or 3 years ago where this gentleman, he was reviewing it, and he said, yes, this material comes out of Smith et al., a book that was written 15 years ago. He was not the author. How he recognized the text from a book that was written 15 years ago, beyond me, but he caught it. We have sometimes complaints, allegations come in from within an institution or within a laboratory itself. And then as far as plagiarism goes, we also run some software against a limited number of proposals, usually once a year. We'll take a random sample and take a look at a number of proposals. But we don't use just the similarity scores that came up. We actually dig in. We look at every reference to make sure that this actually was text that was misappropriated. I thought I took the community standards out there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our case numbers over the last 10 years or so. These go out through 2012. I haven't had a chance to update them since 2013. The lion's share of what we look at is plagiarism in our cases, although The number of data fabrication cases is starting to take a bump up in the last couple of years. But you can see we receive about anywhere from, over the last 6 or 7 years anyway, anywhere from 80 to about 115 allegations a year. And this 2013, the number was just under 100 allegations. This is what I was talking about with the data fabrication. If you'll notice the red line, that's fabrication by postdocs or students. It's always typically been a handful, but in 11 and 12, it jumped up to 12 allegations each year. And I can tell you that 75% of those allegations were substantive. So that's a little scary for us, and we don't know whether this is an anomaly or whether it's actually a trend at this point. And then the number of cases we close every year runs around somewhere 70 to 80. The number of research misconduct findings the agency makes is somewhere in the high teens to about 20. That's mainly because there's only so many cases I can get through the pipeline with 5 or 6 people working for me. If I had more people, I could move more through. Because the line that's important here is the purple line, which are the ones that we refer. You can see that number is going up, which means we're getting more allegations that appear on the surface to be substantive. Just some trends that we're seeing. Allegations peaked in 2008 to 2010. I don't know that they're going down necessarily, but they definitely peaked in that time. Number of substantive allegations, that's on the uptrend. I mentioned the data fabrication of the postdocs. Disconcerting number of PIs who believe that copying text is okay if you include a citation to the source anywhere in the text, not necessarily near where the text you took. Disconcerting the number of PIs who rely on postdocs and grads to write their proposals without making sure that they haven't copied material. Why the increase in the allegations? I think we're better at what we do. Technology is a two-edged sword. It makes it easier to cheat, makes it easier to find, too. And avoiding the dilemma. How do you avoid it? Well, when in doubt, make it clear. As I said, that mantra that we have is QCR, quote, cite, and reference. Know the standards, especially if you're cross-discipline. Whoops. Wow. Especially if you're working in cross-discipline. And you definitely want to check the work of your postdocs and grad students if they're providing information to you. A few of our favorite excuses there for your consideration. The bird vocalization one that distracted him is one of our favorites. That actually turned out to be a former NSF program officer. How much time? How am I doing on time? Fine? Okay, good. Stories from the case files, I promise you that. These are always the fun things. First one was a small business innovative research grant. A professor down at Clemson had a grad student who had finished his master's degree. Grad student wanted to continue the research, didn't want to work on his PhD. Professor says, great, I've got a small business in my wife's name. We'll submit a small business innovative research grant to NSF, and we'll have you continue the work. All above board. They get the grant, student's married, wife is homesick, please take me back to Texas. He's a good husband, takes her back. They've got no PI anymore. So they just decide to pocket the money, and when they file their annual, or the report at the end of the phase 1 grant, it's 15 pages of copied material out of the master student's thesis. Lo and behold, they get the phase 2, which is bigger money. And at that point, professor goes to his department chair and says, hey, I got this phase 2, need to do a little work in the laboratory. Dean says, where's the phase 1? Because deans like to get some of that money. It's just a fact, okay? And the guy hems and haws and does a little Michael Jackson, moonwalk and, all that stuff. And so the dean gets a copy of the final report for the phase 1. Well, he also happened to sit on the master students committee, recognize the text, bada boom, bada bang. Yeah, he pleaded guilty to 1,001 false statement, and I've never seen a check written for $225,000. We have a copy hanging in our office. That was pretty interesting. SUNY shenanigans. Try to make this a little more local for you. We had a professor out of a SUNY campus, not really near here, who reviewed a number of NSF proposals. When you review an NSF proposal, it's confidential. You destroy it when you're done, unless you're him. He puts them all in his desk drawer, and 3 years later, pulls out 4 of them, rips off the cover page, puts his own cover page on, and literally submits them lock, stock, and barrel. Okay, that's the definition of intentional. Okay, that meets the definition of intentional. Okay. U.S. Egypt program, he was debarred for 3 or 4 years. U.S. Egypt program, NSF has a joint program. It's actually worked through the State Department where there's an exchange of research between U.S. and Egyptian scientists. And an Egyptian scientist contacts a U.S. scientist and says, I'd like to work with you on a project as a part of this program. U.S. scientist says, great. In the email exchange between the two of them, it's very clear that the Egyptian has a very, it's English as a second language. He does not have a firm grasp of English. And I'm not saying anything right or wrong on that. That's just a piece of evidence. Yet the Egyptian scientist provided the U.S. scientist with a draft copy of a proposal that was impeccable. Never tripped a trigger with this guy. He just put his little paragraph in there, submitted it. 12-page proposal, 10 pages, plagiarized. Who's responsible for that? The American scientist or the Egyptian scientist, or both? Oh, I'm so glad to hear you say that. Because there's some people who think maybe the American scientist isn't responsible for it. We actually think, given what he knew from the email exchanges, it probably should have tripped a wire with him, that something was wrong. The last one I'll talk about is Disney syndrome, small world. American scientist sits on a review panel for the European Science Funding Agency, reviews the proposal, then proceeds to take 2 pages out of that proposal and dump it into his NSF proposal. Again, as David said earlier, this is just, if you get down to the subdisciplines, it's a small world. So who was on the review panel? The European scientists. And they said, hey, wait a minute. Not only did he copy 2 pages, but that was a unique idea in there. That had never been discussed in the literature or anywhere before. So we got a hold of the official copy of the proposal. Sure enough, those 2 pages were in there. And the university did right. He was on soft money, which means he left pretty quickly. And the agency did debar him for a couple of years. So I'll wrap it up there. Just a little contact information if you ever feel the need to get a hold of me. And I did have a question slide, but I guess we're going to have a session a little later, so I'll stop at that point. Thank you.